entitled The Renaissance of Light Rail. My name is Emma Woods. I'm the Director of Corporate Services with the ARA, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's session for you all. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional landowners on which we meet. For me, it is the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and so I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, we actually launched this report at our Light Rail conference on the 8th of June in Sydney recently, and our presenter today, Nick, attended the conference and made a presentation, but we thought it'd be great to also provide an opportunity for those who weren't able to attend the conference in person or dial in to actually dial in today and receive a good briefing. So Nick Johnson is the General Manager of Strategy Investment for New South Wales, ACT and Victoria at RPS Group. And he's also the lead author of the paper. He brings extensive experience from the infrastructure sector, and he leads a team of consultants who specialise in infrastructure investment, finance, funding, strategy, and transformation within New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT. So Nick is here today, and he's here online. He's going to take us through the paper and talk to us about the various elements that are within the paper. He's also going to make an effort to pause at a few different points and open up for questions during his presentation. So I encourage you to use the Q&A option and pop in your observations, pop in any questions that you might have, and we will do our best to address them as we go through. But also, as usual, we will make time for questions at the end. So for those of you who have joined us before, you will be aware we really strive to make our webinars as interactive as possible. We've got our lead author here today with us, so make the most of the opportunity to ask questions of him, and I will put them to him on your behalf. So without further ado, I will hand over to control to Nick. Thanks for joining us, Nick, and looking forward to the briefing on the report.
Thank you very much, Emma. Much appreciated, and fantastic to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Before I dive into the presentation proper, I'd just first like to thank ARA for the opportunity to undertake this project. It's always good to sort of step back from the coalface of projects and reflect on what makes light rail and other transport projects really successful, and how this knowledge can be used to improve and better understand mode selection in the future. Also, I'd like to thank ARA for some active contribution in the debate in this space. I think from our point of view, when we undertook this research task, we knew that it would be critical that we didn't just come out with a light rail being the panacea for all problems and really trying to be tailored about the advice and recommendations we give. A paper that said light rail was some sort of cure-all was not an acceptable outcome. And so when we embarked on this, we thought to ourselves, well, what are the key considerations that proponents and governments must have when they're looking at mode choice, and how do they balance these? And so as we were going through, we sort of settled on 9 key components for our assessment framework. They were urban renewal and land value uplift, and the ability for a mode to support a land use change. The amenity of the mode itself, both at the stops, on the journey, the accessibility, the legibility, stop frequency, and the total catchment served by each stop, the reliability and the proven technology to provide on-time services with a proven solution, the patronage, the ability to move large numbers of people easily and efficiently, service frequency and travel time savings, somewhat self-explanatory. And then we did also look at delivery constraints in terms of the complexity of delivery and affordability and the flexibility in the routes themselves. One of the questions that does come up a little bit here, and I'll just sort of preempt it, is we didn't look at specific costs of individual projects, but rather when we looked at delivery constraints, looked at sort of averaging out and what are both the capital but then also the whole of life elements that come with that. And so as we embarked on that, we thought these sort of 9 considerations cover off on a more holistic view of what a good transport project can deliver, and it's the way we wanted to view, I suppose, the modes. Now, the modes we chose to assess were bus rapid transit, light rail, and obviously heavy rail. And in doing heavy rail, we also wanted to consider some of the metro elements, although we understand from a technology point of view, they're slightly different, but from an outcomes point of view, there are a lot of similarities to draw. And I know a few people here would be thinking, what about trackless trams in that mix? And obviously those that have seen media release and the reports would know that we did a review of trackless trams and its application in Australia. And in doing that, we kind of looked at some international case studies and principally drew from these four that we found. So there was early on the right streetcars deployed in Las Vegas were designed to mimic trams. There was a number of issues when they were deployed in the Las Vegas setting, particularly because of the environmental conditions and their ability to keep on track, which led to flow-on impacts for timetabling and maintenance. There was a Phileas system deployed in Eindhoven, which was in a protected bus lane, but there are again issues with the navigation system. A similar story for the 40% of the line in Nancy, which ultimately was moved into a tram system, and then France, the electrically powered guided bus, which ultimately had to be removed or is being removed for 2021. So because of these factors, we said, well, look, the trackless tram as a proven solution is probably not ready to be assessed in line with those other modes. I think it's important though that we do point to the key reasons, the unproven technology, particularly around the environmental constraints, including snow, heavy rain and fog, the potentially increased road regulatory requirements for road access, and the potential for a monopolised market. The one important caveat that we do wrap around this though is while we didn't assess it this time round because of those risks, it is considered prudent for governments to undertake a thorough assessment of this mode, particularly as the technology continues to develop. There may be opportunities for that in the future. We'll also get to, when we apply the framework in a little bit of time, as to the differentiation between what we think a trackless tram may deliver versus what we think light rail with in-track delivers. But I did think it would be important at this moment, because this was something that was a bit of a point of discussion and debate, to pause here if there are any questions about how we went about that research and the, I suppose, the recommendation or the consideration that we put forward there. So I'll sort of pause at the moment and just open it up. Are there any questions or things people want to raise at this point?
Nick, I'll give people a little bit of time to type if they are doing that. I don't get to see the little dots like on a text message.
Of course.
But I know certainly at the conference I had an individual sort of raised the comment that obviously trackless trams are increasingly being flagged as an option. What would you say, if, for instance, RPS was engaged to look at trackless trams, what would be the advice that you would give?
Yeah, look, I think just in an Australian context, it's not quite ready. I think there are quite a few eyes on Malaysia at the moment, where the first of the newest technology of trackless tram is currently being trialled. We're in the middle of a 3-month trial right now that started in sort of April. And that'll tell us a little bit more about where the technology is up to. RPS has had the benefit of probably a bit of a longitudinal study, having done work back in 2009 on some of the technical issues that are associated with deploying that solution. And we can see some of those have been addressed, but there are still these key 3 ones that require addressing, certainly in the short term, before it'd be something that we would put into a consideration and potentially advocate for. So while I think it's it's right to research and develop, from our point of view, it's just not ready to be deployed as a solution in the same way that those other proven modes are. And there are probably some concerns around the market and the ability to generate these sorts of things. So that's probably where we would sit at the moment, and to say, yes, obviously keep research and development. Let's see what happens internationally and hopefully nationally, but as a solution, it's probably not there yet.
And I think one of the interesting observations that we sort of made through this process also was about, I mean, and I'm sure you'll come to this, but it's ultimately about the objective that you're trying to achieve. And one of the key benefits to light rail is that property uplift, and it's the tracks in the ground that provide certainty that lead to that development and urban renewal. And you're not going to get that with a line, for example, painted on the ground that could be changed overnight, effectively, just like, you know, a bus network, for example.
Look, that's absolutely right, and that's, you know, thank you for forward selling the next part of the presentation.
Sorry.
But absolutely, I think there's certainly some challenge around what is the land value uplift and conversion elements that would be associated with that you do get with a light rail, and you certainly do also get with heavy rail. So they're probably the key things that sort of jump out. And you know, if there are no other questions jumping up, I might move into how we use that so we can start to see the differentiation between the modes themselves. So the next thing we did was obviously apply that framework to those 4 modes. And here is, you know, in short, how we looked at that: a simple red, amber, green. It's a fairly straightforward exercise, I suppose, just to sort of give us a sense of where we saw benefit. And as Emma quite rightly pointed out, that urban renewal and land value uplift equation around bus and BRT, there isn't a lot of evidence to support that land value shift. There is some marginal benefit associated with public transport, but not anywhere near the same degree that you get with light and heavy rail solutions. Equally though, there are things around delivery constraints and flexibility that buses and BRTs would deliver. And so we kind of stepped back and said, well, what does this tell us about each of these modes that we're assessing? And the sort of short answers we came to were buses and those advancing bus technologies are well suited to corridors that are experiencing changing travel patterns and require stop relocation and route flexibility. So for those that are out there, a classic example right now would be Western Sydney, where you have a large amount of development going to be happening over a long period of time, and you need the ability to flex inside some of those suburban areas as you build your trunk corridors and trunk transport systems. For bus rapid transit and other sort of protected vehicles, we said they're well suited to corridors with high patronage demand and that are looking to sort of manage a movement corridor. So not necessarily looking for some sort of catalytic change in terms of land use, but really to be more efficient inside a movement corridor. Light rail, by contrast, is well suited to transport projects that seek to help catalyse that land use change, while also being capable of meeting high patronage demand through a movement corridor. And then obviously with heavy rail, as people know, it's well suited when you want to move high numbers of passengers across larger distances and catalyse key employment and residential centres. So from our point of view, we sort of said, well, what we've really got there, well, what is light rail? It's a transport solution to a land use challenge. As Emma probably sort of intimated earlier there, and we'll talk about in a little while, light rail really does present an opportunity to drive a land use change through increased value that some of those other technologies don't. And I think that's really probably the important differentiation when we're coming to these sorts of things, where there is an urban regeneration agenda. We see that light rail tends to do a lot better. Where it is really about efficient movement, then light rail may not necessarily be the right solution. So what we sort of said to ourselves then is, what does light rail deliver, and what are its key benefits? So those key things it delivers across the country, and what we found for the most successful light rail projects when we did our research was there is an urban renewal and land value uplift equation. There's obviously an amenity benefit in the ride itself. There is a patronage uplift, and there's a reliability component, and it also does derive some benefit from stop and service frequency and travel time savings. So going forward, this means that when we are looking at light rail solutions, I think we can look at them not only through the lens of what is the transport outcome or benefit, but what is also the place outcome or benefit. I think we're already starting to see some of that, certainly with Newcastle, Canberra and the Gold Coast highlighting objectives around place and supporting housing choice, land use change and economic development as key parts of what they're trying to drive at. And for those that have been working with state government, the place outcomes and place-based planning is increasingly important regardless of the mode choice, to make sure that it is delivering for the communities that it serves. I see there is a question, Emma, so I'm happy to pause now and answer that as we go.
Yeah, go for it.
So it says, does the research suggest then that light rail is not suitable for newly developing areas? Wouldn't that be best time to consider light rail to reduce brownfield construction issues? A fantastic question. So the short answer is that it suggests that a light rail might be appropriate as it develops. And so critically up front, what you'd want to be doing is reserving the corridor and not putting in things that would prevent light rail being delivered in the future. However, it may not be the most efficient way to use it if it's built up front. So there's probably a balancing there. So what we're probably talking about is a temporal element, to Chris, of when is the right time to sort of catalyse that change that you're looking for. But we would be advocating in any of those areas that you are reserving corridors for any of your trunk transport solutions. So in the case of Western Sydney, we know there will be a metro line there, and obviously they need to do the land reservation and corridor reservation as part of that. What I'm suggesting is that it may not be the thing you do up front. It may be something that you plan for and then ultimately deliver as the projects and as the developments come online, and that demand and that amenity benefit can then be delivered. So I hope that answers the question. And I think it probably leads pretty neatly into the next slide, and I will spend a little bit of time on this one around the benefits. So I've talked a lot about the catalyst for urban renewal and regeneration. What we're really talking about there is three factors. There is certainty. So light rail, like heavy and metro rail, provides certainty of a transport solution to the community and local businesses and encourages investment. We have good evidence to suggest property values proximate to stations, certainly with about 400 metres, do benefit directly from that. But I think it's also important to understand that the tracks in the ground represent something for the community and for investment that other technologies haven't been able to adapt to or address yet. And I think that's a critical differentiation. That certainty allows for investment. Then obviously that land value uplift that's associated with that certainty comes in, particularly where you're moving it into lower density areas where you do want to see that change, a bit to the point before, Chris, as you're trying to catalyse that land use change. And so it's a great way to help not just drive it, but also, for want of a better term, organise it around sustainable PT solutions, rather than kind of letting the growth just run. I think the third thing I would say, though, is actually the urban development form itself. We found historically where light rail has succeeded, it's created a more legible precinct and more legible ways of moving around. It's also viewed by the community generally as being easier to understand and interpret and more reliable. So there's an urban development, urban form and amenity equation that comes not just with the ride itself, but with the stops and how they integrate into their surrounding land use. There are cheaper whole of life costs. There's no doubt that light rail will probably be more expensive to construct upfront than some of the simpler solutions. But it is comparatively cheaper to run than other modes. So there are the opportunities to reduce your whole of life costs, particularly around the operating costs per passenger. Light rail, when it's in its right location at the right time, actually demonstrates that you can move a lot of people quite cheaply over the life of the asset. There's an increase in passenger capacity. So there's, we can find areas where you can move up to 20,000 people per hour in one direction in a space equivalent to one lane of traffic. And I think it's fair to say that that kind of movement and that kind of capacity increase is a great benefit. There is also a fair amount of research to suggest that light rail is viewed favourably and often exceeds initial patronage demands because of its amenity and general ability to be able to be used and seen, and is as a reliable solution. The networks themselves are quite scalable. So if the appropriate level of planning is undertaken and that we understand where those potential future alignments would be, the network can be expanded over time and align with the changing needs of a city and its broader objectives. I think it's quite adaptable to evolving technologies. So right now we've got a range of technologies currently in use around overhead traction supply, but also ground level power supply and induction systems. And as hybrid battery, supercapacitors, hydrogen fuel cells come online, light rail is well placed to start taking advantage of some of those technologies and can be tailored to suit the need of the project and the context in which the transport system will be operating. That ease of use and tourist perception is a pretty important one, and we can see what's happened on the Gold Coast, and when they had Commonwealth Games as a classic example of something that's gone very, very well. They have an iconic value, and often domestic and international travellers are naturally drawn to them because of that ease of legibility. And transport is a key element of a visitor experience when they come to a city. And then I think importantly, on that economic side, the integrated networks. So I want to be really clear that this is, while we're obviously advocating for light rail and certain solutions, it should operate as part of an integrated network where it can be tied into a heavy rail solution or a bus network or both. I think, the work that's currently being developed and delivered for Parramatta Light Rail is an example of that, where they're looking to obviously leverage the investment in a metro line around Parramatta, as well as trying to increase and improve that second city, the second CBD in Sydney. And I think PLR will have a great role to play as that project further develops, both in terms of the shape of the urban form that that area will take, but then also in delivering that transport solution so people move efficiently between things in a CBD sense and a classic 9 to 5 sense, but then also when major events are on. I think it's also important to highlight the social and environmental benefits that can be delivered as well. Light rail can link education, sports, entertainment and event convention and health centres together. They have that turn up and go service, but they can also operate in high off-peak and weekend periods as well with their lower operating costs. It's easier to do that. There's often a sense of improved social cohesion because they can improve connectivity, accessibility, and provide some level of independence for commuters. The public transport patronage uplift is a very real one. It is a highly visible mode. It raises awareness of public transport, and we can see in Newcastle and Canberra and the Gold Coast, and there are case studies in the report, which I encourage you to look at, where the patronage really grew as the project came online because of that iconic value and that ease of use. It's a very accessible mode, accessible for all users, and allows for people with different levels of mobility, and I think that's quite important. There is also, quite frankly, a public preference for light rail. The behavioural research continues to find that people prefer to travel by light rail than bus. This is supported by an understanding that passengers globally continue to report high satisfaction with the experience itself, the comfort and ride smoothness, the reliability, the quality, the safety and the security of light rail. And I think it was a Monash University study that actually explored the relative merits of both, and a number of factors actually influence that preference for light rail. And they are the stations themselves usually have better amenities and are easier to locate. The network knowledge is pretty inherent and people can pick up on it fairly quickly. The reliability, so it's separated and protected from other forms of traffic. The priority it receives as it moves through intersections. The satisfaction levels, they are often, I think it's a Transport for New South Wales data, found that over 90% of customers have been satisfied with light rail services in the state, and this satisfaction rate is higher than both train and bus services over that same period of time. And then environmentally, it can result in reduced environmental impacts because it has multiple potential energy sources. It can be quite adaptable. It also usually has lower emissions for both air pollution, noise and water pollution, and creates some urban separation of vehicles. It also creates shared pedestrian zones, which you can see In Sydney here, at George Street, it's a permeable solution. It allows areas to be easy to cross, and it is comparatively quieter and more sustainable than some of the others. I think also it's probably worth flagging at the moment the catenary-free tramways that are being used to open up places internationally and nationally are another great advancement in that shared pedestrianisation and that urban form outcome. So again, Emma, I thought this might be a good moment to just pause for a second. There are a lot of benefits and a lot of download, and the next slide sort of pulls out a couple of key items and research papers that we can talk to. But I thought if we could stop here, Emma, and ask if there are any questions or people wanted to flag anything at this point. Happy to give people a few minutes to type away.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're really preaching to the converted, aren't we, in terms of light rail benefits?
Possibly.
And many on the line would be very familiar with a number of the benefits that you've highlighted. But I always think it's nice to package it all up and really sort of demonstrate how broad those benefits are. If you were to pick one, Nick, what would you say was sort of the number one benefit of light rail?
Look, it is the catalysing of a land use corridor, which is quite unique. So it's not just one, with heavy rail, you get one station and that can be quite a big shift. Light rail has this unique ability to actually regenerate a corridor in different ways. So you can get a lot of different uses, a lot of different connectivity, and drive a lot of different user demand. So it's not just about the to and from work. It can be about getting to the hospital, getting to the sports event, getting to the school, or whatever it is. I think that's where you really start to see sort of off-peak and different demand, and light rail really flex and show its ability. So that would be the biggest benefit, I think. And so when our clients are sort of weighing up and considering what they want to do, we say, well, what is that core objective of the project? And if it is about amenity and creating a land use shift and sort of catering for population and housing choice and economic growth, then light rail will probably have a role to play. Okay, well, I might move on if there are no questions. I think you might be right there, Emma. This might be preaching to the converted. So, thank you everybody for going easy on me. I think it's nice to sort of be amongst friends when it comes to the light rail discussion. I think that the next thing, though, I thought, and perhaps to maybe arm you for these sorts of discussions in the future, one thing that often comes up is, well, it's easy to say there's land use uplift, but what supports that? And so we've kind of done a bit of, additional research into what's been studied. It's fair to say this is an emerging field of study, so I'm sure in 5 and 10 years' time there'll be more information to draw on. But from what we can see right now, there is a bit of a clear differentiation and distinction. So there was a study done in I think 2014-15 looking at BRT and in particular looking at the transit way in Liverpool. And what it found principally was that accessibility improvements do add to house value, but not dramatically. In addition, the empirical analysis confirms that properties that can be too close to public transport infrastructure with negative uplift being associated with the negative externalities of noise pollution and environmental pollution. So I think what we're saying there is, and what this study sort of highlighted was, where there is a need to move people through a corridor, then that sort of BRT solution certainly delivers. It found that connectivity was there. What it found also, though, was that the uplift component was fairly negligible through that corridor. We can contrast that with Gold Coast Stage 1 and ACT, which have both been in operation now, and we have some sense of what's being delivered. The land value uplift that was studied and researched by, I think it was Cameron Murray, conservatively estimated about $300 million worth of land value uplift was created just from stage 1, and for principally land within 400 metres of a station. And that's about 25% of the capital cost of stage 1 of that project. So that gives you some sense of how important and how big that land use change can be. And to further add to that, you can see with stage 1 of the ACT light rail project that house prices in the ACT generally rose by about 17% between that 14 and 18 period. But within that rail corridor, there was a rise of about 39% in the inner north and 20% at Gungahlin over the same period. And that's taken from their benefits realisation report. So I think you can see there that step change is very material when you're delivering light rail. That comes down to the certainty, but it also comes down to creating opportunity. And it's not just about the dollars and cents. What it also creates is housing choice close to transport, close to amenity, and connected, which is something that's pretty critical to those sorts of areas. So from our point of view, when we did the research and contrasted those two things, we said, well, clearly there is a difference. There are times when a BRT solution is the right one, but when it is that catalytic change, we tend to say, well, that upfront investment that light rail requires will probably help deliver the outcomes and objectives you're seeking to achieve. And so, having said all of that and having done all of that, we actually tested two sort of relatively recent projects in Brisbane Metro, which operates as effectively a BRT in a dedicated corridor, and then also Sunshine Coast Mass Transit, which is in an interesting place at the moment where they're sort of looking through and considering what their choice of mode will be. So in the case of Brisbane Metro, we lined up its objectives, or its publicly stated objectives, and said, well, that stop frequency, that level of amenity, but then also some of the service frequency elements, they lend themselves to a BRT solution. The delivery constraints and the flexibility in routes was also another thing that they were looking to, particularly as you can see down the bottom there, addressing some operational inefficiencies in the way that bus network was operating. And so they came to the conclusion that a BRT on road was the way to go. And based on the way that we looked at it, we'd probably agree with that. They weren't really trying to drive some catalytic change. They weren't looking for a large trunk corridor to drive multiple different points. It really was a movement corridor that they were trying to operate more efficiently. And in also developing that, they came up with quite a neat solution from a technology point of view around a bi-articulated bus that they've developed and are deploying now, which is about, I think, 27 metres long and can operate in that dedicated corridor. By contrast, we looked at Sunshine Coast Mass Transit, and they have two big ones around supporting jobs, tourism and a stronger economy and greater housing choice, which lends itself to light rail, and then also from amenity, creating better connections and between key destinations and promoting more vibrant neighbourhoods, which is fundamentally a key part of what a light rail delivers. The reliability component around reducing growth in traffic congestion, and then also the patronage objective that was flagged between the connections was also reasons we think that this project from an objectives point of view actually lines up quite well with a light rail solution. In particular, where they're talking about creating connections between key destinations, but also promoting more vibrant neighbourhoods. It lends itself to a corridor solution, not necessarily a big bang in one particular location. So we contrasted the two to make sure we were keeping ourselves honest and said, yeah, there are definitely times where other solutions would be beneficial, but in this case, for Sunshine Coast Mass Transit, we think a light rail solution is probably the best way to go there, and would be advocating for that. And so when we came to all of this and we thought, well, what are the key recommendations that we want to make? There were three. So we principally said, we think we need to refine the policy framework so that we can assess the broader benefits of light rail. I think we want to really talk about the place outcomes, not just the movement outcomes. I think Transport's done an excellent job of being able to demonstrate the transport outcomes and the benefits they deliver. It's probably the next evolution of that policy framework to talk about those broader benefits. And that will probably result in some reforming of the business case and appraisal approach so that they can consider those land use outcomes. I think also being really consistent in the way those things are measured and also creating a framework for those benefits to be realised over time and managed and tracked over time to make sure that the investment is a worthwhile one and delivers on what you're looking for. I think there's another component to that, which is ensuring that those networks that are deployed are optimized, and that the light rail always takes preference and priority, particularly signal priority at intersections. That's when you get that key outcome that you're looking for around that better connectivity and reliability. And then also as part of that, just improving the stakeholder engagement up front, not just with the community, but also with the local authorities and key peak groups that would be affected by, positively or negatively, that investment. The second recommendation was a coordinated funding approach. So where possible, I think we should seek council or other critical stakeholders like that as co-sponsors of light rail business cases. And I think it'd be good to see the federal government identify what it requires or what it would like to see in order to support a light rail project. I think that would help minimise potential funding delays for some of these things. I think to reduce the overall cost to government, early action could be taken to capitalise on potential value capture opportunities. Value capture is a whole other topic, and I know there's quite a bit of research in that. So I'm not going to pick a side per se on that one, but other than to say, if there is a land value uplift and that there is some sharing that could go on, that would help defray some of the costs of that upfront investment. And there are ways that have been done, and I think one of the examples we use is the work they did in Dublin around a direct land tax. Not saying it's the right thing for every solution, but it is one to consider as a part of that mix. I think there are various levels of maturity around value capture, but as budget constraints are amplified, I think there'll be a greater emphasis on those alternative funding mechanisms. And then the last recommendation, and anyone who's worked on a light rail and perhaps the leading question around brownfield construction issues is we need to reduce delivery phase risk through improve either risk sharing approach and then also better upfront planning. So where there is a specific and significant construction risk, a greater level of investigation should be undertaken up front to mitigate that risk. And where that risk can't be mitigated, or it's not possible to know the full extent of it, a more collaborative risk sharing approach with delivery partners would be sort of advocated for. I think that way you're probably going to get more engagement out of the market. Specifically, the utilities have posed a large risk across multiple light rail projects. So it's recommended that this risk is specifically targeted in the early development phases of a project. Echoing the brownfield construction comment earlier, it's absolutely the case that is a challenge. And I think with greater knowledge sharing and transparency between the utility providers and the light rail proponents, including some risk sharing, then we can probably get a better outcome there. To echo what I said earlier, in a greenfield environment where you do need that flexibility up front, making sure that you've reserved that corridor and that it's somewhat unencumbered so that those things can be delivered in the future, I think is an important one. So those are our three key recommendations, and there is a question, so I will tack to that quickly, Emma, before I hand back to you, or seek further questions from the group. The question is, do you have any thoughts on how Melbourne, being a mature system, can develop in the future? It seems more difficult for governments to justify the additional investment to bring the system up to scratch, city substations as an example. Yeah, look, there's a very interesting debate playing out in Melbourne, and I'd say it extends beyond just the substations. There's also accessibility DDA type requirements. So how do you manage a mature network as the requirements of its users change? I think there's a question that needs to be asked there around, well, it is delivering or has delivered a particular iconic uplift, and that there is a requirement that governments continue to invest in managing and maintaining that network. I think if you are extending that network, you need to be really clear as to what you're trying to unlock. I think where Melbourne probably has focused a lot of its attention is more in the heavy rail solutions for longer distances at the moment, catalysing key precincts. So where I would be looking is to say, well, once those precincts have been catalysed, once you have those large areas, how are they being connected in to the key services around them? And is there the opportunity to expand those networks? Now, on the asset maintenance and management question itself, around how do you continue to invest in bringing the system itself up to scratch? I think that's where Australia has, and Melbourne in particular, has a great opportunity to actually put some work into the research and development of new technologies that can be deployed pretty readily on a brownfield system. I think Melbourne, probably more than anywhere, has the opportunity to kind of look at and understand what a mature light rail network looks like and how they might be able to evolve that, particularly when it comes to, as you've noted there with substations, the evolving energy requirements. Are there easier, lighter ways to put trams on the tracks, and are there ways we can build in batteries into those so that they can continue to operate and deliver that certainty of investment? I hope that answers the question. Are there any other questions from the group, or Emma, hand back to you at this point?
Thank you, Nick. Sorry, I was having some trouble finding my mouse to turn myself back on. No, look, a really thorough summary of the report, and thank you for taking us through it all. So as Nick said, obviously we've got the ability to ask questions, so I encourage you to pop your questions into that Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. And as Nick has already done, we will make an effort to answer any questions that you might have or any sort of further detail that you are looking for. To sort of kick things off, I've got a couple of questions that I have prepared. You've obviously sort of wrapped up looking at the 3 recommendations and sort of unpacking what sort of sits behind each of those recommendations. But if you were to sort of go with one in terms of how do we support this next wave of investment into light rail around Australia and New Zealand, what would you see as the priority?
Look, I'd like to see us get that policy framework agreed up front so we can assess those broader benefits. If we can do that, then we are better able to assess what a light rail actually delivers. It should hopefully make it a little easier to do recommendations 2 and 3 as well, because we know what we're delivering, what we're trying to achieve up front. So I obviously lean towards getting the framework of assessment up done correctly, and probably to do a little bit of a dive into that. It's not just about agreeing the nuts and bolts of an economic framework about what's in and out, but it's also about the stakeholder engagement that needs to go through that period, so that people understand the transformation that's being proposed, the benefits it delivers, and all obviously the associated trade-offs, so that those things are better understood, can be better appreciated, and then also better captured and managed throughout the process of delivery.
On that, the importance of stakeholder engagement, I read with interest an opinion piece or a letter to the editor in the Canberra Times yesterday. It was a disgruntled Canberran complaining about the fact that they were funding a light rail network that they would never use. I always find that amusing because, you know, we all fund roads that we potentially never use, but light rail, for whatever reason, generates a lot of publicity, and both good and bad, but predominantly negative in the, you know, construction phase until it goes into testing and commissioning, and then everybody says, yes, I'd like it going past my house, please. How do we improve stakeholder engagement so that we get less opposition from the outset, do you think?
Well, I think the first thing is, in some cases, is to engage with the stakeholders. I think there are projects in the past where that hasn't happened, where the light rail solution has been arrived at and then in somewhat dictated to. And I think it's important that that stakeholder engagement actually is genuine, and you talk through the objectives that are trying to be achieved. You'll never have 100% agreement on a light rail solution. It is disruptive during construction. It has a large upfront cost. There's no doubt about that. I think it's really about understanding that these areas are transforming over a long period of time. That transformation will happen one way or the other. The light rail actually helps us organise that transformation, better serve it, and create a higher level of amenity in the long term. And that's really what we're doing. The investment is being made now for the future. So yeah, you know, the community member may be a bit upset as construction starts and their immediate life is disrupted, but there are population pressures in multiple centres throughout Australia. Those population pressures will lead to land use changes. With a light rail, you have a chance to sort of organise and build that around a sustainable public transport solution. If you don't do that, then that land use pressure will exist elsewhere, and it can lead to more congestion, more car dependence, which is obviously something that also leads to disgruntled community members, because there are congested roads and other things, and why isn't it, why there's so many people here. So I think it's really about demonstrating that trade-off, and the investment up front can help solve pollutions in the long term.
Absolutely. We've had a question come in that's Melbourne specific. So in Melbourne, would light rail be a more cost-effective solution for the outer ring railway than traditional heavy rail? So I think that's referring to the suburban rail loop project.
Yeah, look, good question. I think, I don't know if it would be more cost effective, particularly because the suburban rail loop is seeking to cover a very large area and also catalyse critical precincts around that area, rather than create connected corridors and sort of corridor uplift. I think the question for light rail in Melbourne would be more one of how do we connect into those major precincts that a suburban and a suburban loop can create, and use that to expand our existing light rail network to create those connected neighbourhoods and corridors. I haven't done specific research into the the cost pluses and minuses of the sort of heavy rail metro style solution that they might be pursuing there versus what a light rail would deliver. Would be an interesting exercise. But my sort of gut reaction is that they're looking more to catalyse large centres over a longer distance than what a light rail would traditionally deliver.
It might also be capacity capabilities as well, in terms of heavy rail versus light rail for that project also.
Absolutely. I think they're wanting to move large numbers of people in critical peak times. So yeah, I think to reframe the question, there's probably the question I would ask is how does that then sit in with the network that they have, and how are they going to augment the network so that all of these things work together?
And certainly, I mean, Melbourne is home to, obviously very iconic Yarra Trams network, and, largest network in the world. I think 250 K is a double track. But also one of its challenges is that it's very slow. And you talked about the importance of traffic light prioritization. And, at the moment, the network that is not segregated gets stuck in traffic just like anybody else in a car or a bus.
Absolutely.
So I understand there is quite a significant program of works underway and planned to sort of improve the travel times and therefore the customer offering and capacity of the Melbourne network. One of the challenges, Nick, and I encourage others that are on the line to put through any questions that they might have, but one of the challenges we've been talking about from an ARA perspective is obviously patronage has been decimated with COVID. Light rail, heavy rail, public transport generally, and people have largely returned to cars. I heard in a meeting yesterday that, cars are sort of 110, 120%, the roads, sorry, at a sort of 110, 120% of pre-COVID levels. How do you think we make the case for continued investment into our public transport networks when our patronage is not where it was pre-COVID?
Absolutely. There's probably, again, two parts to this question. There's probably a PT question broadly, and then a light rail one specifically. So I think there's a silver lining with COVID. Absolutely, people have been more inclined to move to their cars in the short term, but we do know that congestion does sometimes change behaviours. Where I think we have an opportunity from a public transport point of view is that a number of behaviours have been changed naturally through COVID, and we have an opportunity to potentially attract new patrons and uplift patronage in the long term with the right sort of campaigns to sort of focus on bringing people back on when it is safe to do so. I think it's obviously right now there are caps that are put on a lot of the public transport systems that are naturally limiting patronage anyway. So there is a, if you like, an artificial cap put on that. I think we do need to be a bit patient and wait to see when those things have passed, what is the bounce back effect, and whether there is an opportunity to encourage people back onto public transport. In the case of light rail specifically, I was actually quite buoyed by some of the comments that were made at the Light Rail conference, where they have enjoyed a stronger bounce back in their patronage demand than some of the other modes, some sort of indicating they were back to sort of 80 or 90% of pre-COVID levels pretty quickly. As I'm sitting in Sydney at the moment, and new restrictions come in, I think, as of about an hour ago. So while we're in that place, I think it would be premature to start talking about patronage demand and fall off, because there are artificial caps currently in place in different places. I think it's once we're at a point where those things can be removed safely, how do we make sure we attract those people back? And I think there is an opportunity, because those behaviours are being broken, because there's probably a lot more off-peak demand where people are travelling to and from work at different times than they normally would, that there's an opportunity to augment our public transport systems to better cater for that. Hopefully we have that reduced peak, which would be lovely, but then also a more even spread throughout the day to have a more efficient transport system.
Mm. Yeah, and I've certainly heard patronage levels are lower on a Monday and a Friday, with people maximising the ability to work from home and have a slightly longer weekend, perhaps.
Absolutely, absolutely, and not unsurprising. I think that's where the opportunity lies. People are now changing the way they work, changing the way they travel. So when we have that complete and safe environment, and we can have full capacity back on our PT systems, making sure that those PT systems have been adapted to those changing needs.
Yeah, and exactly, we're going to have to. It's not going to be pre-COVID, we're not going to get back to exactly what it was. Things have fundamentally changed. So naturally, the public transport offering is going to have to change as well.
Absolutely.
What about, you talked about, value uplift and property densification, urban renewal, densification, etc., sort of being the number one benefit of light rail. How do we maximise that? What can be done to sort of make sure that you really capitalise on that benefit?
Oh, look, we often talk here at RPS, and I'm sure in the industry generally, about the nexus between infrastructure and land use. I think you need those two things to be operating in concert. So light rail unlocks, it drives a land use change, it creates a value, but that value can't be realised if the planning controls aren't there to match it, and the supporting infrastructure, water, power, those sorts of things are ready and available. So I think, in order to maximise the value, you need to have a clear vision of what that area needs to be, the role that the light rail will play, but also, if you like, a temporal plan. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over 10, maybe even 20 years, as you build out and develop and then deliver these sorts of infrastructure solutions. So I think the critical thing is, and I probably point to the work done up at Newcastle when they were first planning Newcastle Light Rail, to say it's not just a light rail. This is how we are creating an urban regeneration corridor with transport as the spine and the catalyst.
Yeah, and certainly the same has been done in Canberra. I mean, anyone familiar with that northbourne route that was sort of the welcome mat for the capital of Australia, it wasn't a particularly pleasant welcome into the capital city. So, and light rail has really, been the catalyst to completely transform that corridor. So,
absolutely, Canberra is another great example, actually, of that kind of approach, and making sure that the land use fits and supports the transport solution. Equally, the transport solution is unlocking the right kind of land use change that the government's looking for.
now I'm really enjoying picking your brain, Nick, but I think we're probably almost out of time. Any final comments in terms of, obviously, we've worked on the report for the last couple of months, and I really enjoyed working with you on it. In terms of next steps for light rail and sort of drawing some of the learnings from the paper, where would you sort of see it?
Look, I think we're on the cusp of a great, new wave of investment in light rail. I think the comments and questions around Melbourne specifically are probably a case in point, where a lot more thought needs to be go into how we maximise the mature networks there, how we can continue to improve the level of service, how we can continue to improve and attract new customers, but equally, in the capital investment world, where they're looking to expand networks, how do we make sure we've put the planning controls around those things, and that when that light rail goes through, the development industry, the governments and the community understand what the trade-offs are and are ready to adapt and deliver. So I think, from me, the next steps are really about taking these recommendations, advocating for them, but also seeking to kind of implement across multiple projects these sorts of new ways of thinking, and gather that evidence and data, and where we might have made a misstep, understand where that is and improve how we're doing this and delivering these sorts of projects.
Yeah, I think certainly as an industry, there's always a desire to share those lessons learned so that we do improve for future. And there's been a hell of a lot of investment recently, but there are a number of new projects and also extensions to existing projects very much on the agenda. So there's certainly an exciting agenda ahead.
Absolutely.
Look, I think that's it. We don't have any other questions coming through. So a very big thank you to Nick for joining us today and taking us through the paper. We've got here on our screen the URL where you can find, oops, it's gone, no, it's back, where you can find a copy of the report. But essentially, if you go to the ARA website, so ara.net.au, there is a link on the homepage that will take you through to the report. And you've got some copies of some photos there of sort of what it looks like. But it is certainly a very interesting read, and I encourage anyone on the line to jump onto our website and download a copy for your own information. We have got another website webinar scheduled for next week on Project iTrace. So iTrace is all about introducing a uniform barcoding system for the supply chain, and we'll be providing some case studies on the benefits of adopting a standardized approach nationally. We do talk a lot about achieving national consistency within our industry, but we are a bit slow to move in that space. So the aim of this webinar next week is really to showcase what can be achieved with Project iTrace. So anyone within the supply chain space, I encourage you to dial in. Likewise, operators, freight, passenger, etc. There are some opportunities for across industry that can be achieved there. And we've got the link there where you can register. So that's it from us today. A very big thank you to you, Nick, for your time, for putting the report together and for sharing your insights and knowledge with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed. That's the second time I've heard you speak. No, third time I've heard you speak to the report, and I've enjoyed each one. So a very big thank you to you. Have a lovely afternoon and stay safe.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks, Emma. Much appreciated, and thanks for dialing in.
Thanks. Bye.